I'm Dr. Marie Donovan, a professor of teacher education here at DePaul and director of our program in early childhood education. Tonight's forum is the final of this academic year's three-part series concentrated upon literacy writ large. Our purpose in focusing attention on literacy this particular year is threefold. In our fall forum, we aim to raise awareness of the many threats to every American's right to read and think freely that are happening every day. We introduced you to some dedicated teachers, librarians, and scholars whose work keeps us, a free people, able to access and navigate the information we have the right to as citizens of the United States. Our winter forum aimed to highlight the natural connections between and among digital media literacy, student civic engagement, and the preservation of democracy by learning about the work of a Chicago elementary school teacher, along with that of two nationally recognized scholars embedded in schools. Our forum this evening centers on classroom practices in teaching children how to read and the growing issues and controversies surrounding their perceived effectiveness. Our aim tonight is to broaden the conversation about these matters. We've convened this panel of school-based, policy-focused scholars so we can hear their current thinking about what matters most in ensuring all children learn to read, and to understand how they've reached their conclusions. By inviting these researchers to share, we recognize we're also inviting you, our audience, to consider perspectives that presently might not align with or contain the variables you most value in your reading process theorizing or instructional practice. We trust that, like us, you appreciate opportunities to think with other professionals in our field and to find common ground upon which to build your 21st century teaching and research agendas. Tonight's forum is the 41st that the College of Education has offered since winter quarter 2010. These forums were the brainchild of my colleague, Dr. Diane Horowitz, whose boundless energy and insight in formulating as well as executing them makes us all the wiser and sensitive to the nuances of any given issue or movement discussed. I cannot thank her enough for her expert guidance and care in ensuring these forums are timely and relevant to the work we do as a College of Education. Without the expert behind-the-scenes wizardry of Ms. Camille Laxamana and Mr. Will Moody, we wouldn't be beaming into your living rooms and treadmill screens right now. Thank you, Camille and Will. I also want to acknowledge the years of support for these forums by our previous dean, Dr. Paul Zients, and our current dean, Dr. Moshe Bayat. Their belief in the need for us to continuously offer these forums for our students and anyone else who would benefit has been heartwarming and affirming. We're thrilled that 727 people from all over the United States registered for this forum. DePaul students, alumni, faculty, teachers, librarians, district administrators, researchers, parents, and grandparents. Now, as the next hour or so unfolds, I hope you'll post questions to the chat on YouTube there. Given there are almost 700 people attending, however, while we won't be able to respond to every question in the time available, we'll aim to capture the themes that emerge. Also, you'll see in the chat that we will upload some resources from our panelists that will give you further insights into their work and the roots of their dedication to improving reading learning outcomes across our country. We're very grateful to our three panelists who work in different yet connected corners of the reading and literacy universe for making time this evening to inform our thinking. Our first panelist is Dr. Paul Thomas, Professor of Education at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. Dr. Thomas moved into teacher education after years as a high school English teacher in rural South Carolina. He is the current series editor for the Critical Literacy Teaching Series, Challenging Authors and Genres, and he's the author of How to End the Reading War and Serve the Literacy Need of All Students, published in 2020. His collection of highly personal essays reflecting on being a writer who teaches writing to young and older adults, Teaching Writing as Journey, Not Destination, Essays Exploring What Teaching Writing Means, was published in 2019. A former column editor for the National Council of Teachers of English's English Journal, in 2013, the council named Dr. Thomas its George Orwell Award winner. In 2018, Dr. Thomas published his co-edited book, Critical Media Literacy and Fake News in Post-Truth America. In 2019, he received the 2019 Divergent Award for Excellence in 21st Century Literacies. Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, for being here this evening. Our next panelist, Dr. Rachel Gabriel, will share after Dr. Thomas. Dr. Gabriel is Professor of Literacy Education at the University of Connecticut in Storrs. She is the author of more than 50 refereed articles, as well as the author or editor of 6 books for educators and doctoral students pursuing specialization. She's the author, forgive me, of more than 50 refereed articles, as well as the author or editor of 6 books for literacy teachers, leaders, and education researchers, trifocals. Dr. Gabriel currently teaches courses for educators and doctoral students pursuing the specialization in literacy at her university. And her research is focused upon literacy instruction, leadership, intervention, and policymaking related to teacher development and evaluation. Her current projects investigate supports for adolescent literacy, state literacy policies, and discipline-specific literacy instruction. Thank you, Dr. Gabriel, for joining us this evening. Our third and final panelist is Dr. Sonia Soltero, Professor and Chair of the Department of Leadership, Language, and Curriculum, and the former Director of the Bilingual Bicultural Education Graduate Program here at DePaul. Dr. Soltero's scholarly work on bilingual and dual language education, on developing bilinguals, and on Latino education has been published in English, Spanish, and French, and includes 3 solely authored books: Dual Language Education, Program Design and Implementation, School-Wide Approaches to Educating English Language Learners, and Dual Language Teaching and Learning in 2 Languages. Her latest work will appear in the forthcoming edited volume, The Handbook of Dual Language Bilingual Education. Dr. Soltero has been actively involved in dual language and bilingual education for more than 30 years as a bilingual and dual language teacher, university professor, researcher, professional developer, and especially as an advocate. In addition, she has served on numerous national, Illinois, and Chicago education commissions and committees, including the National Association for Bilingual Education Executive Board of Directors. She is the co-founder and current co-chair of the English Learners Advocacy Council in Higher Education, as well as president of the DePaul University Faculty Council. She's also a dear and stalwart colleague, and we're so glad, Dr. Soltero, that you were able to make time for us this evening as well. And so I'm now going to turn the Zoom over to Dr. Thomas. Dr. Thomas?
Thank you. Want to thank everyone who's helped organize this and everyone who's viewing. For about the next 20 minutes, I'm going to do an overview of sort of my work with the science of reading that began around what I would call ground zero for the science of reading movement, which I'll talk about in a second, when Emily Hanford published Hard Words in 2018. So I've been spending the last 5 years or so looking at how we talk about reading and the teaching of reading in the United States, and how it has become a political movement in terms of legislation at the state level. And I want to say that in the fall, I will start my 40th year as a literacy educator. About half of that was as a public school teacher, and about half of it has been at the higher ed level. And I do want to say that most of my focus is on policy, although I will talk about research, and I am trying to target this for classroom teachers, the kind of information that teachers should have so that they can advocate for their students and for themselves. I think the first thing that we have to consider is there is a message in the story that's being told that we're in a reading crisis, and actually the evidence does not support that argument. Here I have what most people consider reading NAEP data for 4th graders over decades has been relatively flat, and you'll notice here we've got several key points. We've had the simple view of reading since 1986. And you'll notice that that is the dominant way that people are taught to teach reading. The theory that most people are taught as their beginning teachers. And throughout that time, we've also had the balanced literacy movement, which began around 1990 as sort of a response to the whole language movement before that. And to be honest, we've had many, many different standards. We have had many, many different assessments. We've had many, many different reading programs. And reading achievement in the United States has been pretty steadily flat. And you'll see here another graphic, same information. And so I think we have to start with, we actually do not have a reading crisis in the United States. What I would say is we have a history of political negligence. Since about the 1940s, the same groups of students, minoritized students, students in poverty, special needs students, multilingual learners. These are the students that struggle the most in our educational system to attain reading, and that has been consistent throughout the history of the United States. And one thing that's disturbing about the current reading war that the science of reading movement has triggered is that it's basically the same narratives that we've heard decade after decade after decade. The 1940s literacy test of draftees for World War II were extremely low. And Eleanor Roosevelt and others kind of sparked a literacy crisis then. And you won't be surprised to find out that the blame was lack of phonics instruction and an attack on progressive education. And researchers at the time, the journal that became Language Arts, quite a number of literacy experts at the time pointed out that almost all of the draftees that had low literacy had gone through traditional education programs and had traditional phonics instruction. Progressive education was not common in schools, but still the attack was very similar to what you hear now. You can just replace progressive with balanced literacy, but it's still, we don't do enough phonics. 50s and 60s, the exact same thing happened. The book Why Johnny Can't Read was very popular. This is the same time period when we had whole word instruction, Dick and Jane readers, which is the way I learned to read. And again, the one thing that was added in the 50s and 60s with Rudolph Fleisch's Why Johnny Can't Read was international comparisons. So you had this narrative that United States literacy was far behind other countries, and then it was going to cause the downfall of the United States, which of course didn't happen. But it was the exact same message. We're not teaching phonics. We should be teaching phonics. 60s and 70s, you had the tension between what some people consider Jean Shaw sort of the beginning of the science of reading, and her work was a response or was counter to Ken Goodman and Frank Smith and others who were associated with whole language. I do think it's fascinating if you get the chance to read Jean Shaw's work. She was very concerned about lack of phonics instruction, but she also is one of the early literacy people that raised concerns about not attending to dyslexia. So you'll see the lack of phonics and the dyslexia issue come up again and again. And those are very foundational in the science of reading movement right now. The science of reading movement probably would not have the momentum that it does if not for all 50 states had a decoding dyslexia group organized when hard words came out. So there was a structure there for this movement to happen. In the 1990s, there was a false whole language crisis, and it was targeting the drop in scores in California. And researchers and literacy experts like Stephen Krashen and Regie Routman pointed out that two things were true when the whole language disaster was announced by the media. One, whole language was the official literacy structure of the state, but very few teachers were actually practicing it. But even more important, when the scores dropped, there was a huge influx of second language learners, and there was a lot of defunding of the schools. So while scores did drop, there was actually no evidence that any sort of literacy theory or any sort of literacy practice caused the drop. That should resonate with us right now, because the argument in the science of reading movement is somehow that balanced literacy or just a few reading programs, specifically units of study, and Fontes and Panelist's work are the cause of the claim that we have this sudden low literacy achievement, which again, as I showed you earlier, just did not actually happen. One fascinating thing from the 90s is Linda Darling Hammond in 1997 published a report that showed a strong correlation between higher NAEP scores and whole language instruction. It's very fascinating. That came out in 97, way past when the crisis was announced, and sort of whole language suffered significantly before that came out. And of course, the media never covered that part of it. And just within the last 20 years, we had No Child Left Behind, which was anchored by the National Reading Panel. And I do think it's important to point out, National Reading Panel, of course, started under Clinton, not Bush, W. Bush, but it was a central part of the No Child Left Behind. And I do think it's really important to point out that No Child Left Behind mandated scientifically based practices, which is what science of reading is calling for now. Also, there was the Reading First scandal. And I do think this is really important, because a huge part of these reading wars is marketing. And what we're seeing now is there's a push to move out reading programs to make room for other reading programs. And that is sort of a pattern that you've seen for decades and decades. So one thing that is problematic is, what do we mean by the science of reading? And I've identified it as three different uses of the term. One is the movement, which is the media, the public, and parents, and political. This is the dominant part of the science of reading, and it's the one that I spend the most time working with. The second is marketing, that we now have materials labeled as science of reading, and states passing legislation that you have to adopt science of reading materials. And then there's actually reading science, which is the research base, which has existed for at least a century. One of the problems with the movement, it is highly politicized, and increasingly Republican governors, Republican education reformers like the Bushes have been very drawn to the science of reading movement. And I've been concerned about that, because at its base, the science of reading movement is saying that teachers are failing to teach children to read, which is very anti-teacher. There's also an attack on teacher educators, and that speaks into the bad teacher myth that started under George W. Bush and created the value-added methods movement. The message that you're getting from the media has been refuted by a large number of scholars. I've got a lot of people mentioned here. Marin Ackerman's work is excellent. The Rankin, Ruby, and Risco piece that's been out recently is also excellent. So there's this disconnect between the media and political messaging and what literacy scholars actually know. And regretfully, as Rankin and Ruby and Risco pointed out, 47 states are now passing legislation, and it's being driven mostly by the media message, not by the actual research, because the research itself is very complicated. And the movement, by the way, tends to say that the science of reading is simple and settled. And the research base is actually quite complicated, and it certainly isn't settled. One of the things I'm very concerned about is the marketing aspect of it. And I just use this one example. If you if you go to Education Week, there's Science of Reading ads popping up everywhere. And the marketing momentum behind the Science of Reading is something we should not ignore. And I do think there's a reason that units of study in Fontes Pinel have been attacked so pretty much savagely, is to make room for a different reading programs and reading materials to be adopted. Multiple states and even New York City have started legislating that schools have to choose from 2 or 3 approved programs, which tend to be structured literacy, and often the structured literacy programs are scripted. So over the decades, the science of reading is, short for what we mean by evidence. And I think the turning point for evidence on teaching reading happened under the National Reading Panel, which discounted qualitative research. So the momentum for only a very narrow type of research kind of happened then, and you see that re-emphasized recently with the science of reading movement. But the debates over the decades have been very similar. They've been phonics. There's been debates about standardized reading score, standardized test scores. Recently, in the last 30 or 40 years, it's almost always NAEP. Identifying, there's always something to blame, and it's very simplified. But it's interesting because the blame is always something different, and there's very little effort to prove causation. And when you say you're using scientific information, you have to actually show causation. And saying, for example, that units of study is causing a reading crisis, there's literally no research to show that. To say that balanced literacy is causing a reading crisis, there's literally no causal research showing that. In my policy work, most of the debates are around like state and federal policy, the quality of teacher education and teacher professional development, theories of reading, the role of phonics and other skills, and the gap between what we call science and classroom practice. So the big points that I think we should focus on is that the science of reading movement has emphasized systematic phonics for all students. It is said that the only thing that matters is the simple view of reading. It is highlighted brain research. It's implementing, states are mandating letters, Orton-Gillingham, banning balanced literacy, banning reading programs. States are adopting grade retention, and a lot of places are referring to the Mississippi Miracle and non-scientific reports from NCTQ. I do think Mississippi is a good place to look, and the reason it is important to look at the Mississippi is, if you'll look here, Mississippi's had steady improvement since 1998. And you've got a big jump here from 2005 to 2009 that's very similar to the one from 13 to 19. All of these gains were before Mississippi's science of reading legislation. And again, there's zero research saying that Mississippi's gains have been caused by science of reading legislation. There is concern that states are getting gains from grade retention. Grade retention, you'll notice here, Mississippi retains about 1,500 students a year. 1,000 of them are Black students. It disproportionately affects poor students. There is research that grade retention will boost early test scores, but that disappears. So I call that a mirage. Mississippi, at the same time, they've had these improvements in 4th grade, have had flat and very low 8th grade scores. So it's not real, it's not retained. I'm very concerned that the movement itself has momentum because of the anti-teacher element to it. more so than that it is a credible narrative about teaching reading and about reading acquisition. And I do think that we have to be careful now, because I'm spending way less energy focusing on the messaging in the media. And I think we have to start combating the actual legislation that's passing. And I do think that is a problem, because states are increasingly passing very negative and harmful legislation, sometimes packaged with the anti-CRT legislation. And it's very harmful to schools. But the two things that I think we have to keep in mind is that a lot of this legislation is mandating one size fits all instruction for children, and it's deprofessionalizing teachers. So I think we have to focus on, is this legislation actually supported by research? And I would say most of the time it is not. And how does it actually impact children and teachers? I believe I'm pretty close to being out of time, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'll turn things over to Rachel.
Thank you, Paul. Yikes, my brain is spinning. I'm going to join Dr. Thomas in thanking our host today. I'm really excited to be here and excited for the conversation that's going to follow our brief presentation. So I'm going to hop right into this brief presentation and sort of pick up a little bit where Paul left off in terms of the history. I'm going to start with now. Here we go. So it's 2023. It's a whole vibe. It's really fun. It's great. We all feel some kind of way about it. And from 30,000 feet, we've got a couple of things that are true sort of wherever you look. Like if you were flying across over the country at the moment, these are the kinds of things that you would notice. You would notice that whatever state level legislation is doing, it is narrowing what counts as good reading instruction. In more cases, it is not just saying what kinds of things count as good instruction, which is pretty typical of state legislation of the last 20 and 25 years. It's often also saying what does not count, so constraining, not just describing, but also putting boundaries around what is and is not good reading instruction. And as a result of that, and a result of the reliance on mandated curriculum packages as a policy tool, what students are going to be learning in the next couple of years is increasingly prescribed, meaning it's chosen in advance, not necessarily responsive, and disjointed. And part of that disjointedness has to do with number 3, which is the number of vendors that are participating in the everyday activity of schooling. So there's been, if we think about 2000 to 2010 or 15-ish as the accountability era with the introduction and rapid spread of high stakes testing, we can think about the last 5 years or so as the privatization era, where many of the functions of local education authorities, whether it's your school board or a central office or even just a principal, are being outsourced. And sometimes that outsourcing is really helpful and really needed. And sometimes that outsourcing is just kind of following a pattern where once you outsource one thing, you have to keep outsourcing the rest. So I think we're all familiar with the idea that if you purchase part of a package, it then becomes easy and in some cases important or necessary to purchase the rest of it. So if you purchase a universal screening tool, you then need to purchase the intervention that goes with it and the data management system that goes with it and the data storage system that goes with it. And then also the training that might go with it. And a lot of the functions that used to be locally controlled and therefore accountable to local community members aren't anymore. That partly means that they don't always necessarily fit a vision. So we'll look at an image of that in a moment, where instead of one kind of integrated vision of what instruction might look like, you have 7 or 8 different programs competing for the attention of a teacher and competing for the time during a literacy block, especially in an elementary setting. The other thing that is true, and this is not limited at all to public schools, but there is this increasing distrust of public institutions in general, distrust of the medical field, distrust of teachers and educators as professionals. And this is pretty acutely felt by folks that are working in and around schools at the moment. So we might think about the way that people put a lesson together as sort of putting a recipe together or putting a dish together in order to feed people. We have to think about balancing ingredients. We have to think about who's allergic to what. We have to think about how certain people and certain groups of people need more and less of certain nutrients or certain components of a meal. And we have had in the past districts and schools and even classrooms within schools that have had a really different approach to creating the meal or the lesson. Some folks have just, here's a credit card, have fun. Some folks have had basically on the other side of the spectrum, a microwave meal, and all you do is poke a hole on the top and stick it in the microwave, and that's it. Some folks have had various degrees of freedom to compose the meal the way that they want to, using whatever knowledge or creativity they have. And at the moment, there's a push to collapse the range of variability here to make it less variable. But part of making it less variable, we've run into this problem where there aren't, even though companies will market themselves as a comprehensive program, it's difficult to have a comprehensive program that gives you pre-K to 5. It's easier to find K3. It's hard to have a comprehensive program that gives you equally high quality phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, comprehension, fluency, writing, and other instruction. And so folks are often bringing in actually a few different sets of prepackaged programs and curriculum. It's tough to find one comprehensive program that also comes with the kind of assessment that fits your other assessment systems, that aligns with your content areas, that plays nicely with the system you have set up for math. And so we do see this mix and match of a bunch of different brand name programs at work in classrooms at once. One of the popular ones around where I work is combining something like Foundations and Hegarty and Handwriting Without Tears and Words Their Way and the teacher's job is to figure out, how do we create anything that feels like coherence for the learner and anything that looks like integrity for the instructor when we have and are required to use so many different kinds of tools. And if we come all the way down to earth, thinking very basically about what we're doing when we teach literacy, literacy is essentially an act of integration, integrating visual and oral, perceptual and motor, receptive and expressive, reading and writing. The reciprocity there is synergetic, meaning that when you do both of those things together, they make each other better. And so the only way that we can say we've got high quality literacy instruction, the only way that we can say that we're really doing literacy development, is to be thinking more about integration than isolation, thinking always about how the parts come together in a whole and how they interact with each other. So I like to think about this as through this metaphor of the oak tree. And I want to thank one of my former students, Christina Giuseppe, for drawing this out for me. I used to have a very ugly clip art version of this picture, but she was able to sketch this out. And I think it helps me think about how there are these levels of language and that all interact with each other. Phonology and orthography, the sounds and the letters, really don't mean anything. They're sort of arbitrary symbols and they're random sounds until they become meaningful words. And words by themselves, might be interesting. I'm a geek about words, but they don't really do much in the world until they become part of meaningful phrases and sentences and assemblages that match the audiences that they're made for, that match the discourse patterns and the pragmatics, that organize language into something that does things in the social world, whether it's written or oral. So I like to think about the movement, the early movement of the science of reading, as being a group of folks that were really interested in what I think about in this metaphor as soil science. They are soil scientists. They're really interested and concerned about the nature and quality of what happens, if you will, below ground in the phonology and orthography, before we really get into meaning and context and genre and purposes for reading and writing and motivation and engagement and all of these other factors. And if you care about trees, you do have to care about the soil. You do have to care about what you put into the soil and whether the pH is right and whether there are too many rocks for the roots to grow. You do have to care about what happens below ground, because at least when a tree is brand new, the roots are the only thing that feeds it. As soon as a sapling has any leaves, however, and here I think of leaves as literate experiences, reading, writing, listening to text, talking about text. As soon as a tree has any leaves, the leaves actually feed the tree more than the roots do. They have more surface area, they collect more sunlight and more water. And so when a tree is growing, it's likely getting nutrients from both places, but once it has enough leaves, once it has had enough literate experiences, the leaves feed the tree and the tree feeds the roots. And so you might think about botanists, people that study plants, as folks that are concerned with the balance. Yikes, don't come at me for the word balance, or do. They're concerned with the balance, they're concerned with the comprehensiveness, that are concerned with the inclusion of lots of different ways to nurture a plant, to nurture a young reader. And botanists are not unconcerned about what's happening below the soil, but they are much more concerned with the life of the tree. Whether they have motivation and purpose, whether they have exposure to language, whether they are experiencing lots of different genres and reasons for reading and writing. I think the obvious implication of this metaphor is that there isn't really a reason to pit these two groups against each other. Each brings kind of an interest and an expertise. And if you find yourself more drawn to one of these areas than another, then you can be part of a synergetic team that helps fill in what makes trees grow. The other implication is that trees are going to sort of grow toward the sun. They're going to have big branches and lots more leaves leaning in directions that are more nurturing to them, the ones that they're more interested in and motivated for, the ones that they have social support for. I have a really little limb reaching out towards, I don't know, like tax forms, but I have a much bigger limb reaching out towards recipe books, cookbooks, and cooking magazines. More practice, more exposure, more success, and therefore more practice, more exposure, more success. So if we think about readers as organisms, as humans, reading is part of our humanity. It's not something that we necessarily are born knowing how to do, but it is an inherently human ability. And the humanity part of it means that it is an embodied thing that we know and can do. So if we think about reading as this embodied human thing, we've got to think about the integration of the skills and the strategies, of the levels of language, of the experiences, and of the ways of teaching and learning all of these different things in a way that lets them be integrated and lets us be most interested in how they interact, not super interested in measuring each one of them separately. Because honestly, separately, they're not that interesting and not that helpful to humans as humans. Knowing random definitions or being able to match sounds with written symbols is only a party trick unless it drives toward meaning, unless it drives toward communication, unless that communication is meaningful, does something, unless that communication has an impact in the world. And as a result of there being so many ways to think about nurturing a tree, there also are lots of ways to poke fun at how people tried this thing and it didn't work, or did this thing they said they promised would work and it didn't. And so this is sort of how I feel about it. There are definitely times when there are fads that come through. There are definitely reasons to be wary of any and all fads. And there are some fundamentals that we can think about when we're thinking about what is here behind the fad that is worth paying attention to, and what are the things that we already know are going to mess it up. So you could think about it the way that I think about chocolate, as a component that might draw someone in to a healthy meal, a component that is really good for you in moderation and can become less good for you when it's not in moderation. And I might think about that like reading aloud to kids. If you do it all day, every day, probably you're not paying attention to all of the nutrients that kids need. But if you don't do it at all, why would kids even know that reading is something that they want to do? Where would they get the example and the modeling? Where would they get the exposure? So we think about not necessarily balance, but intentional combination, the way that you think about that in a recipe. I also think about the way that like what we provide to teachers has to fit what they already know and need and what they have at their disposal. So you might have a gourmet pizza that was created by somebody very fancy and frozen at the peak of freshness and delivered. But if people don't have the infrastructure to cook that frozen pizza well, you're not getting a gourmet pizza out of that delivery. You're getting an oven cleaning problem. I want to take a step back and follow some of Paul's footsteps for a minute and just think about how reform movements in general often gather steam by telling a simple story. And that simple story isn't necessarily based on verifiable information, or is, but it's not true. So we can think about the last sort of three movements that, or some of the last three movements that have really had an impact on reading instruction and what it looks like. And although they've had an impact, and although the impact has not necessarily all been a negative impact by any means, the central claim that made this movement appealing to people, that put people behind it, that gave it, that made people show up to vote for it, that made people show up in organized groups in order to advocate for it, the central idea behind it was an unproven and or disprovable falsehood. I want to spend a moment with the bottom one. It's not as popular or well known as A Nation at Risk or as the widget effect in more recent history. And it doesn't need to be, because its message is sort of being carried by social media and by regular media. And so this is the idea that the reason we have enormous achievement gaps in the country, opportunity gaps in the country, and the reason that achievement is lower than people want it to be for whatever reason they have for understanding achievement levels is low, and they are in many cases. The reason for that is that teachers aren't using high quality instructional materials. And if they were using high quality instructional materials that are based on the science, that are based on the science of reading, that are based on structured literacy, whatever you want to fill in the blank with, if the materials were different, the outcomes would be different. The problem is that that assumption, like the assumptions behind the other movements, isn't actually true. We have pretty good evidence that changing the curriculum doesn't impact achievement levels all that much. That individual teacher practices do, but curriculum materials themselves don't, in part because they depend on an infrastructure for delivery. They depend on people having all of the materials so that they can do it the way it was intended. They depend on people being able to do just that curriculum and not necessarily trying to mix and match things from lots of other curriculum programs. They depend on having professional development that's aligned and supportive, and leadership that understands and is aligned and supportive of that curriculum. So curriculum itself is really not a variable that's going to leverage huge changes. It may be part of a solution, but it isn't by itself a solution. The policy solution right now, if you look all the way at the third wave, which is where we are, is buy new stuff. If you look at what's included in science of reading legislation across states, and we're getting past the tipping point, we were at 26 states at this fall, and more and more states are considering or passing science of reading focused legislation. All of the bills that I've looked at and laws that have passed include something about restricting or mandating specific curricular programs, which essentially means stop what you're using and use this instead. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing if what you're using is essentially a mishmash and it's chaos. Like if what you have for reading instruction at the moment is piecemeal and not very intentional, and everybody's doing it differently, so you can't really collaborate, any change is likely to give you a bump. Where there was chaos, it's likely to give you some stability, and that will lift everything. But where you did have some intention, some coherence, some leadership, some professional development, and in some cases where you have had teachers developing curriculum in that context for that community over a long period of time, turning on a dime means giving up a lot in terms of human and human assets and human resources. It means likely teaching transition instead of teaching children. We've had a whole series of state legislation focused on reading, and it tends to use exactly the same policy tools to try to achieve its goals of increasing reading scores and closing opportunity gaps. And in the early 2000s, it really came out of states' efforts to put No Child Left Behind in place. And so it was focused on making sure everybody was doing scientifically based reading research or best practice. And in the 2010s, there was a focus instead on ensuring that students with dyslexia were identified and supported early and accurately. There is the idea that many, many more kids actually have dyslexia than are identified with dyslexia. And the implication is that teachers don't know what they are looking for, are not looking, or are choosing not to see it, and are therefore withholding necessary instruction from students that would benefit from something else. Right now, we have pretty much the same set of policy tools, but instead of being focused on evidence-based research or brain-based research, it's now science of reading research that it goes in the fill in the blank. In all cases, and so therefore all states have several layers of laws that require we screen for difficulty, monitor progress, use based practices and tools, focus teacher prep on reading, focus PD on reading. And now we're saying on the science of reading, not just reading. So in terms of will these policies have their intended effect? Well, the last two didn't, so I don't know why we think the third one will. And that isn't because it isn't a good idea to incorporate science and to ensure best practice and to screen kids and focus teacher prep on reading. All of those are good ideas, but we have pretty good evidence that doing these things several different ways over 2 decades hasn't significantly changed conditions for learning. What is changing over time is what's going on with the nature of those levers. So in the early 2000s, it was you should do some screening, but very few states were mandating a specific screener. In the 2010s, the idea was to prescribe some things. So you saw many menus of options for screeners, for curricula, for intervention programs. And these menus of options were meant to sort of solve the problem that leaving it wide open had allowed, which is that people were doing lots of different things. And now we're in this era of specification where it's not just what you can do, but also what you can't do. One of the things that happens when you control curriculum is you also control what texts are read, when, and by whom. And therefore you're controlling what identities and families and communities are represented and what topics are addressed and in what ways. You're controlling what tasks students are engaged in and what social positionings are available to them in those tasks, whether they're able to see themselves as leaders, see themselves as protagonists, see themselves as good, see themselves as agentic. And also who qualifies for support and who qualifies for enrichment, whose intelligence or ways of being in a classroom are honored and whose opportunities are expanded, and whose ways of being in a classroom are deemed deficient, and therefore their opportunities narrowed and forced into repetitive remediation. Controlling curriculum means controlling a whole lot of things. And in some cases, controlling curriculum is very tightly linked to concerns about what children are reading, to concerns about what teachers are saying, to concerns about what is being taught. So reading legislation may not be supported for the same reasons or by the same people as book banning, or as parents' rights in quotation marks, or transparency laws, but it's doing the same thing. It's benefiting from the same momentum. It is being carried by the same currents as this stream meets the book banning stream in the larger policy river of right now. And unfortunately, as Paul was saying, we've got big promises and no accountability. Mostly we've seen from the last wave of legislation that it's having unintended effects only and none of the intended effects. The effect of screening and training and providing intervention and focusing so much more on dyslexia has not been to identify more kids, but it has been to identify less diverse kids. It has also kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of what's making our current moment possible. laid the groundwork for making it really common and easy to question whether public schools have any idea what they're doing. It has replaced a lot of homegrown assessments and homegrown professional development and teacher preparation and materials and tools. And in some cases, as I've said, that has been helpful. And in some cases, as I've said, that has been a step backward for some communities. I think the mechanism for this is really selling certainty in a time of uncertainty. This is really similar to the way that we sell things that are seen on TV, diet programs, the whole prosperity gospel, the idea of like there was a before and there is an after, and anything that came before is trash and should not be touched, and you've got to have real allegiance to the new thing. And also the idea that all positive change is linked to this one small change that nobody was talking about before. It's brand new. And the people who are giving it to you are the only ones who really care about you. Everybody else was lying to you. We know these narratives if you take a step back and say, what kinds of stories are being told? Or what kinds of stories are being sold? We know these stories. These are conversion narratives. They are prosperity narratives. They are usually not the truth. And because we're benefiting from the momentum of so many other things that are focused on narrowing, prescribing, and banning, we don't have to have legislation in every state for science of reading to be impacting instruction. We don't have to have prescriptive legislation in every state in order for it to impact instruction in prescriptive ways. Now, providing incentive, the way Race to the Top did. Race to the Top didn't require anything, it just incentivized things. So we have states like Massachusetts incentivizing districts to get rid of anything that seems balanced literacy, and instead they'll get a grant to buy something that's on the Massachusetts list. We don't have to require it if we incentivize it. We don't have to incentivize it if we vilify everything else. So underneath all of the policy and politics are still students and as learners, are still teachers as human people that spend time with other human people in their classrooms. And they still are responsible for nurturing the humanity of their students and their literate development. And I think that looks like coming back to the very simple things, like if we think, how do we make sure that this tree is going to grow? We need sunlight and water. How do we make sure that these readers are going to grow? They need to write to an audience for a purpose. They need to talk about text. They need to read for meaning, and they need some modeling with feedback. And if you can find those things in packaged curriculum, and I'm sure that you can, then that's great. Lean into those. And if you don't have what you need, this is what you need to be building. And if this is what you're doing and you're wondering if it's okay, it's more than okay. It's non-negotiable. That's all I got. So I'm excited now to hand it over to Sonia.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you, Paul. A lot to think about in the time that you were speaking, so I took a lot of notes. I'm going to share my screen, and based on your discussions, we can clearly see that the stakes are very high, not just for students and their academic achievement, but also for teachers, for funding, the repercussions of this movement. As you said, Rachel, we've seen this movie again. And the historical component of where we've been and where we're heading seems to be sort of a vicious circle that we go around and around on these supposed reading wars. So I'm going to talk today, this afternoon, around multilingual learners and how this particular population of the United States has been sort of left out. And my role as along with many other researchers and scholars in the field and practitioners that are bilingual educators and come from that field of language acquisition and are very serious concerns around this, what some people call reading first on steroids, some people meaning me. We've seen this before and it hasn't worked. And so when I talk about multilingual learners, yes, most of the discussion that I'm going to have here is about English language learners, students who are developing English as their second language, but think also about bidialectal speakers. So speakers of dialects of English that we have in the United States, and how this affects their processes and learning to read in usually the school language, which is the standard English language. First, I wanted to share with you the demographic realities around English language learners in the United States, and then talk about specifically Illinois, since we are in Illinois. And it's important to note this, that these numbers are self-reported by the districts and the schools. So we know that these are underreported numbers, and there are a lot more English language learners than we have data for, because a lot of the parents oftentimes don't want to have their children labeled as English learners. One additional thing that I want to add is that as I talk about this particular population and the connection to dyslexia in the special education world, is that in the 50s, in the 60s, and even up to today, but more so around that time before the 50s and the 60s, is that a lot of the English bilingual students were misclassified as special needs, as having to be placed in special education. So we've had that history related to English language learners that needs to be at the forefront when we're discussing the science of reading. So here is some of the data around the numbers, and this is data from 2019, so it's 2019, 2020. So it's a little bit old, and the numbers have shown that these numbers are increasing. 10.4% or 5.1 million students of the total student population in the United States are multilingual learners. You will see me switching back and forth with different terminology. Most people and the federal government refer to multilingual learners as English learners or English language learners. You will hear me refer to these students as multilingual learners or developing bilinguals or emerging bilinguals. 64% of teachers in the United States have at least one multilingual learner in their classroom. So, and I think if you look at the demographics, this would be even higher in urban areas. Not surprisingly, Spanish is the number1 and continues to be the #1 language spoken by multilingual learners, with 76%, 3.873 million. Arabic is the second most spoken language by English language learners, and you look at the big jump from 76% to 2.6%. Chinese 2%, and then Vietnamese is 1.5%. Across the United States, we know reading scores of multilingual learners on the NAEP English test were below those who were not English learners. And that's not surprising, because the tests are in English, and these students, by definition, are still developing English as their second language. So one of the things I'll just briefly talk about is the problems with assessments and assessments that are designed and normed for English speakers that are then given to students who are learning and acquiring English as their second language, which is not valid or reliable data. In Illinois, where we are, multilingual learners rose over 260,000 in AY 22-23, from 242 in 2018-2019, which means a 10.1% increase. So we see that there is an increase in the language learners and families that typically are young families that come into from other states or coming from other countries or regions of the world that don't have developed English yet. This is from Illinois State Board of Education. At this moment, 13.7% in the state of Illinois are English language learners. And again, this is probably an undercount, as we know. And similar to the US population of languages that are represented in English learners are Spanish, Arabic in Illinois, of course, Polish, big community of Polish speakers. That's the number 3 language spoken in Illinois, followed by Urdu. And finally, in the state of Illinois, from the school code, Article 14C, does require bilingual education from pre-K to 12. In most other states, this law, any laws that refer to bilingual education as being required includes K through 12, but does not include preschool. But in the state of Illinois, this law was passed about 10 years ago or a little bit more, which requires preschool to also offer bilingual education when there are 20 students or more of the same language that speak the same language in the school. So what does the research say about the science of reading and multilingual learners? So the research is that we see inequity in sameness. So sameness, to provide the same instruction, the same approaches, the same materials, the same assessments for English language learners does not equate equity. So these are some of the scholars, and this is from the National Committee for Effective Literacy that I'm a part of, and I will show you a link to. It's a very it's focused on bilingual students, but it's really a very good source. There are a couple of white papers and also some websites and some webinars that are very helpful for teachers to understand the stakes for language learners. So despite the changing demographics in the US, mainstream reading research remains entrenched in Anglocentrism, Eurocentrism, and another form of ethnocentrism that is of alphabetism. So sort of not including in the research in this quote unquote science of reading, those languages that are not alphabetic. The extreme inconsistency of English spelling sound correspondent has to confine the science of reading to an insular, Anglocentric research agenda addressing theoretical and applied issues with limited relevance for a universal science of reading, meaning beyond English-centric approaches and research. The science of reading should attend to linguistic, cultural, and individual variations, honoring and leveraging different student strengths. The science of reading needs to be reimagined to make it more robust and socially just. And finally, and there's of course a lot more very poignant quotes, but I wanted to share these, the final one. Bilingual education, and this is from Goldenberg, promotes bilingualism and biliteracy. So not just being able to speak and understand, but also to read and write in more than one language, which has been mostly ignored in the debates over literacy instruction in English only versus bilingual instruction. And I'll talk about that in a moment as we get closer to the end of the session. So the question is, how English-centric is the science of reading? And the short answer, it's almost all of it is English-centric, comes from English, research done on English-speaking students, and comes from an English ideology. So for applying for science of reading to English learners is just a recipe for disaster because it is very English-centric. And even in our discussions, particularly legislation in Illinois, in the state of Illinois, and discussions with various groups, and having those dialogues with the science of reading groups, they do recognize that that is a gap. So this is from one of the white papers from the National Committee on Effective Literacy that I'll show you. I'll give you the link at the end of my presentation that I co-authored with Herrera, Martinez, and Olsen, who just came out in December 2022. Current literacy development trends that claim to represent the science of reading, but actually focus on only a few narrow aspects of literacy, are a serious cause of concern among researchers, practitioners, and teacher educators. Rather than representing the full comprehensive set of literacy skills that the science of reading has identified, these efforts frame literacy development and literacy instruction from an English-centric standpoint that is based largely on the research with monolingual English speakers. It further narrows literacy development and literacy instruction to just English reading, frequently hyper-focusing on phonics instruction. This neither represents the actual science and research on reading, nor adequately speaks to literacy development for multilingual learners. And so with that, I want to give you a couple of statements and some food for thought. What do you think about this? Decoding without meaning is not reading. Some people say the students are reading, but all they're doing is decoding because they're not really comprehending what they're reading. Then that's not reading. That's just decoding. Reading requires more than knowledge of discrete phonics skills. It requires a whole complexity of components that Rachel talked about. Discrete skills alone will not help in developing high levels of reading comprehension. Comprehension literacy processes have to be learned at the same time as discrete skills. What we're doing now is doing heavy doses of phonics, heavy doses, as Rachel said, of these siloed programs that are not interconnected, and they're certainly not interconnected into the reading process. And processes like inferencing and predicting and summarizing and visualizing, all those things that are actually universal aspects of reading that can be transferred from one language to another if they're taught in their native language. Reading comprehension requires background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge. So building vocabulary is very critical, but not just building vocabulary in discrete ways, but building the background knowledge associated with that vocabulary. And finally, there's a lot more, obviously, but reading is an inherently cultural process. Now, pause here for a moment. What does that actually mean? Can you divorce language from culture in reading while students are decoding text and extracting comprehension from those texts? It is a cultural process. And here's an example for those of you who speak Spanish. So the title of this slide is food for thought. In Spanish, comida para pensar sounds very strange. It doesn't translate. And this is where that cultural process and that bilingual brain comes in. Food for thought does not translate into Spanish at all. And this is where a child who hears this, food for thought, who's an English learner or an adult who's not fully proficient, will think. It's food that I have to take to the thinking, right? Here's your food thought. Comida para pensar is not the same. So background knowledge, just to give you a few examples around background knowledge, like food for thought. Background knowledge is very critical, provides the connections to understanding new knowledge, and the more that is known about a subject, the better we understand it. So again, thinking about the English language, English as a second language student who is developing, is developing through a bilingual brain process, but also think of yourselves as English speakers. If I show you this sentence, unless you know what this is about, this is very difficult to comprehend, even though all the words here in this sentence are known to us as English speakers. The difficulty of your set would be increased if you do a jam followed by a peach. So if you don't know anything about this particular topic, this field, then this makes no sense at all. You would think this is nonsense. This is a nonsense sentence. But if you have background in gymnastics, this is what it means. But you have to have that background knowledge. So this is points earned on a gymnastic routine can be higher if two skills are included on the uneven parallel bars. Jam means a gymnast stays sitting on the high bar, and peach means that the gymnast moves from high to low bar. Unless you have that background knowledge, all these words you know, but you cannot extract meaning because it makes no sense unless you have the background knowledge of a gymnast. So again, another example here. The meanings of certain words depend on other words that surround them. And this is true for any other language, not just English, but particularly for English. So think about the word run. Appears to be a simple word, high frequency word, but it has, I think, I don't know, somewhere upwards of 390 definitions. depending how you use that word, means different things. Can you run the store? Can you run in the election? Can you run in the race? And there are many more examples. So it appears to be a simple vocabulary word that can actually not so easy to decode, but you can learn how to decode that. But very difficult, very different meanings according to the context and according to the words that surround them. And then, of course, in English, as in other languages, but in English especially, words that have multiple meanings that depend on the subject matter. So think about, what is a table? So I'm sure most of you are going to say, well, a table is a piece of furniture. But what else is a table? So again, another word in English that appears to be very, very simple, one definition, but no, actually has many definitions. So chemistry, we have the periodic table. In geology, we have a water table, mathematical, multiplication table. To suspend as a verb, we're going to table the motion, or the motion has been tabled. So think about that. And that's what, well, not just English language learners, but also English speakers have to contend with, understanding the background knowledge and building that background knowledge to be able to use the vocabulary words in the right context, and also be able to interpret what the text says in the right context. And also think about here, if we're using this word table or run in an assessment question. So if the student doesn't interpret the right meaning of the word, then the assessment, the question response is going to be incorrect. Sorry, my thing here moved a little bit. I want to very quickly, I don't know how much time I have, to consider the differences between English language learners or multilingual learners and monolingual English native speakers, and think about the implications. So the first one is that monolingual brain processes information from one linguistic source, and the monolingual word in this case would be English. The bilingual brain, on the other hand, or the multilingual brain, processes information through two linguistic and two or more cultural and interlinked processes. Emergent bilingual children are learning to read and write at the same time they are learning English. While English native speakers, they already know, they come into school knowing English, the English sounds and the English language. Obviously, they don't come into school speaking and understanding academic English, but they come in with a foundation English. Emergent bilingual children are exposed to their first language, whatever that may be, Mandarin, Spanish, Russian, at home from birth, and their L2, their second language, in school later on. While native English-speaking children are exposed to English inside and outside of school from birth. Emergent bilingual children have to learn the teacher's language of instruction at the same time that they're learning the English language, while English native speakers understand the teacher's language of instruction. Reading materials and assessments are not designed for English as a second language, or they are weak translations of English materials and assessments. Reading materials for English-speaking students and assessments are actually designed for them. They're designed for native English speakers. Most assessment tools used with emergent bilinguals are linguistically and culturally biased. Even if they're in English, they're linguistically and culturally biased. If they are translated, they're usually bad translations. While for English assessments, they're in English, are normed on English speakers. And finally, not all languages are alphabetic or opaque like English is. English is an opaque language and English is an alphabetic language. None of those things are considered when we're talking about, or very few, the science of reading. So very quickly, because I think I'm running out of time, we think of the 4 language domains, of course, reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Oral language is the foundation of everything, and it's clearly the foundation for reading and writing. At the core and at the center, like Rachel has said, is meaning. If we're not extracting meaning or encoding meaning in writing, then we're just encoding and decoding. So in the case of all students, we're talking about the 5 linguistic structures. the morphology, which are the words, the phonology, the letter sound correspondence with phonics or phonemic awareness. Syntax is the grammar within the sentence. Semantics are the meanings, and pragmatics is how we use language in various contexts. For bilingual students, there are additional things going on in the bilingual brain. The metabilingual awareness, which meaning the metalinguistic, but metabilingual is because the students are engaging this awareness and this understanding in their bilingual brain or multilingual brain, two systems or more systems that are coming together. And then cross-linguistic connections, those connections between language A and English or language B, and the things that are in common and the things that are different between the languages. Of course, we know that Latin-based languages and alphabetic languages have much more proximity versus languages that have no alphabetic and don't have Latin or Greek roots. And those are have less proximity in their similarities. I wanted to show you, this is the, if you want to take a screenshot, multilingualliteracy.org. It's the National Committee on Effective Literacy. It's a group of excellent scholars that have been around a long time, doing research, conducting research on bilingual, the bilingual brain, the bilingual biliteracy. On the left here, what you see is the white paper that I referred to, that I'm a co-author. And this one was specifically targeted at early childhood. The majority of language learners or bilingual students are concentrated in kindergarten, pre-K through third grade. And that's where early literacy begins. So this is specifically to that population of early dual language learners. And this is a white paper, it's a little shorter, that Kathy Escamilla and others wrote, was the first white paper that is also very helpful. With that, I just, if you want to take a screenshot very quickly here, these are some podcasts that and blogs and interviews around this intersectionality between languages, particularly Spanish and English. And finally, one last quote. The brain processes and builds language systems in relation to each other. Developing both the home language and English simultaneously leads to strong cognitive, educational, and social benefits. Robust home language skills provide a foundation for and frequently transfer to developing English language skills. Rich language experiences in the home language are the bedrock for solid language competencies in a new language and serve as assets for supporting children along a pathway toward full bilingualism and eventual biliteracy. And with that, thank you very much. And I'm going to pass it over to Marie.
Thank you so much, Sonia. And if Rachel and Paul, if you wouldn't mind putting your cameras back on, and Sonia, keep yours on. Well, as you can imagine, lots and lots of questions and comments have been pouring in, and it's been just so fascinating to me, and I'm sure it would be to everybody, three of you who unfortunately weren't able to see these questions and comments, those of you who were speaking just now, the three of you, but I've been putting some of them into the chat so you have a sense of what folks have been wondering about. And in the time that we have remaining, I want to start with a question that I think encapsulates some of the themes anyway that were emerging in the questions and comments that our audience left in chat. And this question is along the lines of, so what's being left out in the conversations about science of reading or no science of reading? You know, what about what we know to be the significant, conditions of many schools that in which, the communities, the children who attend these schools, they live in, they're torn by violence. Their communities aren't receiving, getting the resources they need. Just thinking about the impact of poverty and systemic racism on so many of the student populations in our schools today, not only in urban areas, but beyond. And why I think this question is emerging, of course, has a lot to do with not only here in Illinois, but elsewhere, where the movement to, push for science of reading, get that legislated. One of the main arguments used for it is, well, this is what's going to help, poor children. This is what's going to help, children of color, children who go home and don't speak English at home, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, Sonia, you want to start off by responding to that? And turn on the mute. Yeah, I'll turn it over to Paul, because he was we were having a conversation before the seminar started. I think we need to consider the history that Paul shared with us, and consider that this, and Rachel as well, that we've seen this movie before. History repeats itself, and 15 or 20, almost 20 years of reading first did not provide evidence of any progress. On the contrary, and as I said before, and you can quote me, this is reading first on steroids. It's even more critical, and it's even more extreme in my opinion, only because it's being legislated as the one size fits all. We don't have to legislate one approach to reading. That is very, very dangerous. And the money that is involved, as you saw, both Rachel and Paul discussed, the amount of money that is behind these movements is, I think we need to really pay attention to that. I'll turn it over to Paul.
Yeah, thank you. To me, this is not substantially different than any other reform movement since A Nation at Risk. And as Rachel pointed out, almost every single simplifient is based in a misinformation, and it's anecdote, it's a false claim, it's overly simplified blame, it's overly simplified solutions. And in 1967, Martin Luther King said, instead of trying to fix schools to solve poverty, we'd find that if we address poverty, our schools would be fine. And that has always resonated with me, because he talks about the difference between direct and indirect action. And the reason I say we have political negligence is because politicians do not want to do direct action. Our reading scores would go up if we had universal health care, if we had food security, if we had well-paying jobs, if we had a lot of our students are transient. They don't know where they're going to sleep from one night to another. And if you're in the first grade and you don't know if you're going to have a meal or where you're going to sleep, to be perfectly blunt, reading doesn't matter. So I think this is an issue of the tension between direct and indirect action. And we've got decades since the 1980s of politicians being more concerned about keeping a finger pointed at blaming teachers and blaming schools than in actually doing something socially that would, probably erase a lot of these problems.
In my head, there was like cheering and applause, and it's strange to hear silence after something like that. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that. I think in many ways, the science of reading movement is a distraction from things that will change conditions, from people being able to study impacts of things, work to change them. It certainly is siphoning attention and energy and money toward a debate that is very titillating. People are all over it on social media. People are looking at documentaries. We're all tuning into the podcast. It's really captured our country's imagination in a way that changing conditions for learning has not. And yet changing conditions for learning is what's going to change trajectories of learning. Changing curriculum won't. It never has. It never will. It's really kind of a minimal thing in the bigger picture of somebody's school experience. There are two things that I think are sort of double-edged about the science of reading. One is it's something that it's difficult to argue against. You would never say you wanted to teach unscientifically. You'd never say that phonics is a bad thing, although I want to qualify that a little bit, but we don't have time. You wouldn't say that people shouldn't be teaching explicitly and systematically. You wouldn't argue against it. And so the easy refrain is, if this is good, why isn't, then it must be good for everybody. And if you don't think so, then you are the person with a bias. So there's that interesting kind of flip. And yet we know that instruction does look different and that the match between the learner and their instruction matters. And instruction does look different in different communities, across different cultures, in different languages, across different patterns of interaction, across social groups that have different ways of interacting with one another. One of the things that is true of the classrooms that I've observed that have transitioned to one of the core programs that are on state lists these days is that there's much less interaction and much more teacher direction. Some kids need more teacher direction, and they tend to be kids who have had fewer positive school experiences and are still building skills. But other kids need more interaction, and English language learners are one population that grows and develops because of interaction. And so if they're deprived of it, then that's essentially language deprivation. It's essentially creating delays and creating the problem that a new program will solve. The last piece that I think is likely to happen based on what I've been observing so far is that we are likely to see a lot more behavior problems and a lot more kids whose teachers wonder if they have an attention problem because kids are sitting in more whole group instruction with less opportunities to talk and read or write independently. And I'm sure there'll be a program to buy for social emotional learning. However, we also could do some direct action and allow interaction and movement. If the science of reading was about following neuroscience in particular, neuroscientists currently are thinking a lot about pitch and phonemic awareness, rhythm, and being able to sequence and blend, and movement and rhythmic movement. And so if we were really following the science of reading, then we would be doing early intervention with music and dance.
And I would add that one huge impact is going to be on teachers who are not going to, as we've seen this before, are not going to want to teach in those schools that are high needs, potentially because of the problems with attention with the students, but also it's a way to kill the love of reading with young children, because we've gone overboard with controlled texts and texts that are, we're leveling books, but we're also leveling students. And so the pressures on teachers are going to be increased again. And again, the teacher bashing. It's the teacher's fault. It's not the science of reading fault, it's the teacher's fault because they're not delivering as they should.
Well, that brings me to a question that the way it's formulated sums up another theme that emerged just now. And I know that we're out of time, and I realize that some of you will be leaving, but I do want to, and thank you so much for coming. Those of you who need to leave before I pose this last question to the panel. So those of you who need to leave, please know that you will receive an email in which there will be the PowerPoint slides that you saw from some of our presenters, as well as additional links to additional resources, as well as messages about, oh, we're having another forum in the fall. So please stay tuned, keep looking at your inbox. And so a final question for the three of you, if I may. Coming from a teacher, what can we do as teachers to advocate for policymakers to make informed choices, not reactionary decisions or false promises of easy answers?
I think we just got to keep stressing, we want to serve the individual needs of every student. Scripted programs do not do that. You've heard just wonderful information here about how it's not simple, it's not settled. This is very complicated, it's very human. So I think we've got to advocate for the individual needs of all students, and teacher autonomy is at the center of that. The only person that can make the decision in the moment is the teacher, not the publisher, certainly not a legislator in the state. So scripts and prescriptions and mandates don't work when you're working with children.
I think there's, we talk about there being the media saying there's a crisis in reading. I think there's really a crisis in representation of the perspective of educators and policymaking at all. So this is a start local with people that you know kind of a thing, and then keep talking. You don't have to have a perfect talking point. You don't even have to have a plan. You just need to be talking to people who are on your school board. School boards still have an interesting set of power that in some cases is outsized and in some cases is nothing at all. And so knowing who's on your school board, introducing yourself to them as a citizen or as a teacher in the district, and telling them about what you value and what you're concerned about is an important first step. And then you think beyond your district, and then you think beyond your town and county, and then you think up to the state level. People are often surprised at who has a friend of a friend of a friend who is a policymaker. So if you are willing to reach out to people or to reach out to your network for an introduction to someone, and all you have to say is, hi, I'm a teacher, and this is what I value most, and this is what I'm most worried about. That's all it has to be.
And I would add that there's always strength in numbers. I think all Rachel and Paul, and I was a classroom teacher, and I never went to the principal's office by myself. I brought along 3 or 4 other teachers with me. And so there is strength in numbers. And the one thing that I see different, I don't know, Rachel and Paul, if you have it different than reading first in the early 2000s, is that I don't think we would have had 700 people show up to a reading first discussion. This is really getting teachers and educators sort of coming to the dialogue. Like, what is it? Why are we doing this again? Why am I as a teacher being told that I have to use, like you said, Rachel, multiple siloed programs that are just pieces of the reading process that are not connected to each other? So I see a lot more interest in the dialogue and concern from educators.
One of our audience members also commented that there had been just recently, within the last week, some changes to some of the bills that are going through our legislature here in Illinois. Legislators are listening to, to those who are saying, hey, wait a minute, one size doesn't fit all. And so I have not looked at the language and the revised language. The last change I saw was filed last Wednesday, I think it was. So certainly I'll be taking a look too, but some have said, no, they've been making changes. And so, and again, we will be commenting on the State Board of Education's literacy plan once it's unveiled to the Board of Ed itself. I believe that's supposed to happen in June. And certainly Paul and Rachel will be keeping you posted on how that turns out. So again, on behalf of all of us here at DePaul, I want to thank everyone for joining our panelists today to talk about these burning issues in reading instruction, not only here in Illinois, but around our country and actually around the world. A friend over in the UK who was hoping to tune in tonight, but just couldn't stay up. But as she said, I hate to miss it. I'm looking forward to the recording because I have this conversation every day. So we're not alone. But again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, panelists, for making time for us. And we look forward to seeing everyone at our forum when it starts up again in the fall. Have a good, restful, relaxing, fun summer.